Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heads Up, the weekly podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, migraine strategist, founder of the Facebook group Migraine Nation and chronic daily migraine survivor. I am here today with somebody we all know and love, Dr. Joanna Kempner. Hello, Joanna, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me back.
Thank you so much for being here. So we all know Joanna, she's awesome. She's an associate professor in sociology, and she also happens to be the author of Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health, which you can see how well-worn my copy of her book is. It's an awesome book, and that's what it looks like. So on episode 12 of Heads Up, we basically define stigma in relation to migraine, and that it is something that is happening when society devalues us because of our condition. So today we're going to move into the actions around stigma and migraine. We're going to start by looking at where the stigma came from. We are going to look at how stigma can physically and mentally harm us if we internalize it or believe it. And then we're going to move on to discuss how we can keep this from happening, how we can keep the stigma from affecting us. So, Joanna, I wanted to start because it's my understanding that you and I have very similar migraine histories. We both started experiencing migraine in preschool and then moved into adolescence in the teenage years. And we heard a lot of things from the world, from doctors and everyone, including if you just handled stress better, you'd be fine, that we were hypochondriacs and stuff like that. So let's start by, I'd love to hear one of the stigmatizing things you heard growing up.
It's hard to just pick one stigmatizing thing, but I think that overall it was just a sense that I was a weak person,
yeah,
and that I just couldn't handle my life, and that was a really hard thing for me to swallow because actually I was extremely athletic and I knew that I could handle pain. So that always really struck me as odd because it didn't actually correspond to my life in any other way.
Yeah, I can relate to that entirely. Yes, I'm glad you said that, you know, being athletic and being someone that you knew you could handle pain because you're experiencing it all the time and people would tell you that you were weak. So I can totally relate to that. But let's start by looking at where the stigma comes from. In your talks, you talk about something about the migraine personality and how our thoughts in society around migraine are related to our thoughts on gender. So can you give us a brief intro into the migraine personality and gender?
Sure. So there are two really important take-home points here. The first is that physicians always, back in time and today, like all of us, we make assumptions, we use tools from the world around us. Mm-hmm. The stereotypes, the things that we think are true, come from the social world. Mm-hmm. And that was true, that's true now, that was true 100 years ago. So when physicians were thinking about why people got migraine 100 years ago, they were looking at the patients in their clinic, and the patients in their clinic, they were wealthy, right, and they tended to be white and privileged. And from that, they extrapolated that migraine had something to do with people's personality, mm-hmm. Particularly because in the early 20th century, physicians were very excited about post-Freud. They were excited about personality theories, behavior theories. And so they thought that perhaps it had something to do with people being a little too driven, obsessive, people who were type A, who needed to relax. Now, for men, that was considered a quite good thing. But for the women, and of course they saw a lot of women patients, type A personality wasn't very useful for work because women then, especially upper class women, weren't going to work.
Right.
But that kind of obsessive personality would be a housewife who just couldn't let go. Right. Couldn't relax around the maid. Couldn't go to 30 dishes in the sink. Certainly wasn't relaxing in bed with her husband.
Exactly. Yes. You've talked about this before. It is a little funny in hindsight, but it's true. It got us to where we are today in our thought patterns. And I think you even told a story about how you were only like 5 the first time a physician told you that you had type A personality, and it was likely the cause of your migraines. Is that true?
That is true. And did not have a type A personality then, and I don't now.
So can you please tell us what you mean by internalized stigma?
So internalized stigma is what happens when one hears all of these stereotypes and starts to believe them. Mm-hmm. And certainly there were lots of stereotypes that I did believe. One of the things that I took on was the idea that migraine was not sufficiently important disease to talk about or to take action on. And I felt that way most of the time writing my dissertation, and then eventually my book, even though I was writing about why people thought it wasn't important. I thought, well, maybe, I kind of felt like a little like, oh, maybe I should be writing about something new. That's internalized stigma when you start to adopt what you think other people think about you.
Right.
And that can be very damaging.
I really want to hear about how internalized stigma can affect us mentally and physically, make us, harm us mentally and make us even sicker. Because I know I've heard you speak on that before.
Yeah, so absolutely. So this internalized stigma is associated with a number of really poor health outcomes. Mm-hmm. If you imagine, feeling so badly about yourself, of course, that's what happens. So people who internalize the stigma, they have a lower quality of life, mm-hmm. Lower self-esteem. Right. Part of that is because people who internalize the stigma aren't as likely to talk to people about what's happening to them. Right. It also means that people with internalized stigma have a greater tendency to catastrophize. Mm-hmm. They have a reduced sense of personal control over their pain. Mm-hmm. And they also, it has negative effects on health and psychological functioning in general. Right. The part about this that I really get concerned about is this internalized stigma leads to label avoidance. People will proudly wear their pink ribbons for breast cancer now, mm-hmm. and will probably show up for walks. But not many of us will do the same for migraine. Now, this is a process. Not everybody, it used to be that people were ashamed of having breast cancer. Exactly. And there was a process through which people became proud to be a breast cancer survivor. Right. We migraine, we have to go through that process, right? Yes. Where we're not so afraid to tell people we have migraine. Yes. And that's what I really hope happens. Yeah, it is a hard process because most of us, even some of the people closest to us, family members, don't always understand, and there's a stigma coming from them. So when we want to talk to the rest of the world about it, you have to practice, you have to learn. And so, yeah, it is a process, and I'm excited to get there. All right, so I've heard you discuss some ideas on how we can stop the effects of internalized stigma, stop them from harming us mentally and physically. And I love you have sort of a little outline, a list of things we can do. So can you please tell us what that is? I think the first thing to do is identify what stigma is and how it's affecting you in your life. Yes. Right. And part of that is negative talk, right? Mm-hmm. We all engage, well, maybe some people don't engage in negative talk. I'm not one of them. But, sometimes when you're feeling down about yourself and you're engaging in negative talk, first of all, you should recognize that you're doing it. Mm-hmm. But some of that negative talk is going to be you mimicking and copying these stigmatized ideas about migraine. Right. So the first step, I think, is just recognizing mm-hmm. what it is you're saying to yourself. So, for example, triggers, right? So I really think that this language of triggers that physicians give us is very individualistic, right? So mm-hmm. it's individual right at the center of migraine management, where we have to identify all the things that might be triggering our migraine. Now, that can be a useful management strategy for some people, some of the times. It's not that I'm discouraging you from doing that, but what happens every single time you have a migraine? You blame yourself because you think you did something wrong because you didn't avoid your triggers. Exactly. Yes. And the other thing that happens is what happens when you have a migraine and what do other people say to you? I mean, what do they say or what do we feel they're saying? Well, both. Both. Yeah, I mean, we feel like we failed, I think, when we have a migraine, or we feel ashamed. We feel ashamed. Ashamed. But that comes, I think, from people also saying, did you drink enough water yesterday? Mm-hmm. Did you get enough sleep? Wait, didn't you go to a party last night? Maybe you shouldn't have gone to that party.
Right.
So we're internalizing those messages.
Yes.
So the first thing is identify that negative talk, I mean, that trigger language that's real. Like, you're really hearing that. You're hearing that from not just from your physician, but from friends and family, and those friends, and they're all getting it from the media. So the media is always talking about this, right? That's the only migraine story you'll ever see is about triggers.
Right.
So think about then the second step is think about where you're getting those ideas. And if you're getting those ideas just from like out there in the world, those are stigmatizing ideas. And then the third thing that you have to do is you have to think about how to reframe that thought, right? Like, how are you going to take that thought and say, you know what, maybe I didn't do anything wrong.
Yes.
So but you just spent an entire lifetime with migraine learning about triggers. So how are you going to reframe that?
Right. Well, you just have to turn it around from what people have said to you into a somewhat empowering thought, I think, is what you have said in the past.
Well, I have a couple ideas. I have two
Okay.
so far, and I would love to hear more ideas. There are two approaches to handling this. The first one is, I think, the more Buddhist, calm approach.
Right.
Treating yourself with loving kindness.
Right.
Would you say to your best friend, I can't believe you didn't drink enough water yesterday. This is your fault. You should have gone to that party. Why did you drink that glass of wine? You wouldn't say that to your best friend.
Right.
You would say something nicer, right? You
Yes.
would say, you have a disease and that's why you have a migraine attack now. Or you would say, sometimes you can't get enough sleep and that's okay.
Right.
Or you would say, it's a great thing that you get to spend the day in bed today. You get to relax and keep your cat warm. Boy, your puppy loves you today. What a wonderful thing that you get to keep your puppy warm.
Right.
And so part of that Buddhist philosophy, I think, is to embrace that impermanence and that unpredictability of your disease and just say, it is what it is.
Right.
Let's not place so much value on how productive we are.
Exactly.
That is not, our productivity is not indicative of our moral worth.
Yes, I love that statement. I've heard you say that before. I'm just going to rephrase where we were. So it's first, make a list of these things, or notice when you're thinking these things that are like an internalized stigma, and then reframe them. And we're on the Buddhist one, which is very nice. I'm happy. And then you have another way of reframing.
The other approach, which is the feminist approach, and
right.
that's the one that I embrace, is the angrier one, which is like, I'm not going to feel this way just because somebody's telling me to feel this way.
Yeah.
Right? I'm gonna fight that. And also, it's more like a civil rights matter. This is a matter of social justice. The world can and should better accommodate our needs, right? So let's say I did go out late last night. I went to a dinner party last night, and this morning I have a migraine and I can't go to work. Well, you know what? My work should have flexible working hours, and I would be able to go to work. Why doesn't a workplace have that, right? And so we can just stare down that migraine stigma and say, this world isn't made for me, but it should be. I have a lot to give, and I want the accommodations so that the world can receive what I'm worth.
Right.
And so, I can also reframe things and say, you know what, I accomplished so much as it is, and I need to give myself credit for that.
Exactly.
I remember that productivity doesn't equal work.
Exactly. All right. So we have talked about what stigma is, where it comes from, and then we said to notice these stigmatizing thoughts, these thoughts that stigma trains you to have, and then reframe them. Think about where they came from and reframe them. And I think it's such an important message. Is there anything else you wanted to add to our topic on migraine, stigma, and gender?
Well, you know what? Sometimes stigma is going to get you down. Don't beat yourself up. This is a constant. We're all working on this together.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much, Joanna. That was awesome. And goodbye to everyone for this week. We will see you next week on Heads Up, the weekly podcast of the National Headache Foundation.